Lazy daisy, light and dreamy. Dip it with chips, it's extra creamy. Spoon it, swirl it, mash it, savor it. Dollop on top, it's family favorite.
Man, I sure do love my editor, Wet Afros. Last week he let me borrow $50 and drove 30 miles to pick me up and drive me to the 7-Eleven by my house. Oh, how's his editing? About that. Speaking of editors, let's see what Jim Elden Ring could sell more copies if it had an easy mode. Sterling, everyone's favorite anti-capitalist who enjoys capitalism, if it means Elden Ring gets an easy mode, has to say on the matter when it comes to how you should treat your editor.
Hello, patrons. It's been quite some time since I wrote an update blog about your second best trash girl's various doings. For the most part, there's not a massive amount of exciting stuff going on in my neck of the dumpster. I'm mostly looking along, been doing some videos I'm super proud of, wrestling is going tremendously, all told, not bad. That said, there's one major change, and while the long-term result will be positive, the circumstances are, to put it bluntly, really shitty. Some of you have already noticed that for the past couple of weeks I've edited the Gymquisition videos myself. That is because I am no longer associated with my former artist and editor, Justin McDaniel. This association ended due to exploitative and abusive behavior.
Sterling was experiencing abuse for a significant amount of time, and Justin had begun working for him at some point in 2017. So we can assume that between 2017 until right about now, the abuse began at some point and had been continuing for many years.
I had tolerated this behavior toward me for some time and didn't listen to people around me who warned me I was being mistreated, and it was not until others came forward to tell me that they'd been treated the same way that I accepted what had happened. I confronted him and cut ties with him over a week ago, and I've just been trying to process the whole thing and work out how to talk about it. I can say I put up with a lot over the years. I put up with theft, I put up with manipulative behavior, I put up with being talked about incredibly hurtfully behind my back.
Add this truth bullet to the chamber. No, seriously though, Sterling never says exactly what was stolen from him by the employee, nor how he was manipulated by said employee, or exactly when the manipulation, theft, and other abuse began from this employee. So we have a nebulous time frame here.
When you find out the guy you pay around $30 to $40 an hour for an average of 2 to 3 part days a week with breaks literally whenever I wanted, is telling people you're overworking and underpaying him and taking their money while you've been lending him cash without expectation of payback, and after he spent 6 rent-free months in your home.
Man, it would be very unfortunate if there was a distinct reason why that employee had to spend 6 months in your home. Man, hopefully it was something that Jim Sterling didn't cause them to have to deal with.
Well, let me tell you what hurts. I'm not entirely comfortable sharing all the details of his exploitation of others, though they're largely the same.
Not a single screenshot or an ounce of evidence for a single accusation in this, by the way.
I was told about emotional abuse, manipulation, objectifying, and enabling behavior, and a general pattern of selfishness at their expense. For the time being, my husband Phoenix is working on the Gymquisition's graphics. The new work-in-progress logo is theirs, and has been the past 2 intros and outros. Conrad has taken over editing Podquisition, and I'm doing all the video show editing like I used to back in the day. Creatively, I think this is working out nicely. A lot of editing that commenters praised in recent times was stuff I'd done myself. People just assumed it was Justin because he had the main editor credit.
Now keep in mind, Jim is completely capable of editing the Gymquisition, the main bread and butter of his brand, if need be. A good skill to have in case something may occur that makes it so you're unable to pay your editors or something, you know, something like that.
I'm also just really good at cobbling together this kind of content. I'm not technically proficient or artistically skilled, but when it comes to adding engaging visuals to an audio track with just the right amount of pacing and style, I rate myself fairly highly.
Alright, Jim proceeds to start gassing themselves up, so I'm gonna need to skip a couple of paragraphs.
Since we're here, I might as well get something quasi-related off my chest that I've carried for a long time. It's been dredged up by all this, and I feel I need to get it out. I've never mentioned what I'm about to talk about publicly before. I'm a previous victim of financial abuse. For many years, I was in a situation where I did not have control of my own money. I was denied access to bank accounts, what money I could spend was monitored, etc.
Alright, so this one's a doozy. We'll take Sterling's word and assume it's true, and we'll be charitable for now. It's not like this might have very unfortunate implication about Sterling's character.
I was essentially a resource where my agency was not a concern. My value consisted of what money I could bring in, which was never seen as enough. It's very easy to take advantage of me, really. I'm too willing to believe my own incompetence and glom onto someone who is better than me. I'm very easily gaslit, and I'm terrible at self-advocacy. The short of it is that after I got myself out of this abusive relationship, I was left with over $100,000 of debt that had been building up without my knowledge, consent, or control.
Sterling, as read earlier, stated he lost everything. Family, money, and was forced to claw their way out of debt as they were recovering materially and emotionally. That was what Justin approached for more pay.
Contrary to what some people love to claim, I am not quote-unquote rich. That was never true to begin with. Patreon figures never reflective of what I take home after failed transactions, fees, taxes, paying people I work with, etc. But I can't emphasize enough where I lost everything. My grandparents meant the world to me, and everything they ever left me has been lost on this as well. I never wanted to say anything about it, as desperate as it got, as devastating as it was. I can't tell you why. If you offer me a list of reasons why an abuser doesn't speak up, I could probably just throw a dart at it. Thanks to several hugely lucky breaks, losing everything I had and a massive amount of accounting and sales help from my husband and Conrad, I have somehow clawed myself out of the woods. Those gays can do whatever they want shirts have quite genuinely rescued me. That said, I'm still recovering both materially and emotionally. More than the money, being solely responsible for the consequences of what someone else did to me has been a level of pain I can't adequately describe. He knew this. When he told me he wanted to be paid more, when he told others I underpaid him, he knew my past history.
My evil employee knew the entire time that I was financially abused, yet he still approached me to ask for more money. Keep in mind, Justin is an employee working under Jim Sterling, who is struggling at this point. Sterling, who in this very document explains the financial hardships they are going through currently. And in this very same document also explains that they are capable of doing the editing themselves to a degree. He can't afford his editor, is basically what's going on right now. But he still keeps them on payroll out of the goodness and kindness of his heart.
It's probably the part that hurts most. I couldn't afford to keep him, but I kept him. I've never once considered so much as paying him less, even when I was advised to drop him. And I've been made to feel so guilty about not taking care of him that when I was struggling the most, I raised his pay. I felt responsible. I never felt like it was enough.
All pretense aside, Justin is an employee, possibly a former friend, but let's keep it 100%. If you can't afford someone, you gotta let them go, reduce their workload, or find some way to accommodate them. I pay a lot of people for my channel. If my house explodes tomorrow, I can't just make them feel bad for asking for more money or for wanting to be paid more for the work that they do. I shouldn't be making them feel shame or guilt for feeling that they're not being paid what they feel they deserve.
There's a lot of shame and embarrassment that comes with finding out someone you trusted was taking you for a ride, especially knowing you weren't the only one. In fact, it wasn't until I had read accounts of behavior from other people that I accepted what had happened to me. It's like they held up a mirror when they described how they'd been made to feel. I'm eternally grateful that they came forward, as much as I'm horribly sorry they had to be involved at all. They've asked to have their privacy respected, so I'm not bringing them any further into this. Once again, I'm incredibly thankful for this. It's all just so sad. I've had turns feeling angry, feeling ashamed, feeling afraid. More than anything, I just feel sad. Anyway, all of this took more words than I'd planned. This post was not meant to be dominated by that. In truth, I wanted to say nothing. I wanted to just go away. But it's not something I feel I get to do. I want to thank Fee, Conrad, Jane, and Laura, as well as my friends Ollie and Mark, who all supported me while dealing with this. Especially stuff like this can damage you really to trust. I try not to let myself be too guarded. This has opened me up to being hurt, but it's also allowed me to have support I wouldn't ever trade away.
Sterling again mentions other victims in this situation, however he doesn't summarize nor name any of these alleged other victims, and it really makes it hard to really account for that in this situation because we don't have any evidence for Jim's side, nor do we have any evidence for these other supposed victims. A single comment from a patron summarizes the main issue with this situation. The more I think about this, the more uncomfortable it makes me feel. Is it really appropriate to drag out what is essentially a pay dispute in public like this? Steph, can you really say Justin only worked part-time when you apparently need 3 to 4 people to cover his absence? And if you are paying him a decent wage, why would there be a need to throw him any extra cash? I'm sorry, but a lot of this doesn't add up, and framing it in the context of I have finance-related trauma, therefore my employee is not allowed to voice dissatisfaction with pay is a cheap way of getting people on your side. Aside from saying why would there be any need to throw him any cash, they clearly had some relationship that went beyond business, but I'm jumping ahead. Things happen to people, help people out to a degree. We have no idea how much was lent as well. Alright, that's James Stephanie Sterling's side. We read it all and we went over key parts of it. If only we had the other side of the story. Let's have a look then.
As many of you now know, I am no longer working with James Stephanie Sterling in any capacity. They've recently posted a statement on their Patreon listing the reasons why, or at least their side of it. Complaints of emotional and financial abuse from me. I truly sound like the most ungrateful employee in existence who worked for the most righteous and innocent person ever created. I'm sure they worked very carefully on that statement as well. I've also been thinking about this statement I would need to write. For the last week, I've waited for them to write a post saying that I was no longer working for the show. I had no idea if they would attempt professionalism or begin complaining about me to the others the exact same way I apparently abused them. It appears like the latter. I started working for James Stephanie Sterling in full-time capacity in March of 2017. I agreed to start at $1,500 a month because it was the average income that I was making at the retail job at the time. The reason they offered me the job was because the retail job was constantly changing hours and they'd be messaging me for help with projects and I'd have to say no. So when they offered me the position as art director, they said the goal was paying to have access to my skills whenever they needed. They told me when I started about how there would be growth. Notably, they told me that every year I would be getting a raise.
Working full-time for about $1,800 a year is not exactly a great wage, but realistically, Sterling isn't rich, so that pay is to be expected for a channel that doesn't generate that much revenue. Patreon and Sterling's store are their primary sources of income, especially since they don't run ads on Jimquisition videos.
That's not how they came to word it over the years. Originally, I didn't even add the Jimquisition and related podcasts. I was asked to simply be on standby, and whenever they needed help with a project, I could jump on my computer and hop to it. I'd create strange little images, make physical props like the cornflakes homunculus mask, and various graphic design works like redeveloping the website. Whenever they weren't asking me for help, I kept busy trying to come up with more ways to contribute. Eventually, after editing a few podcast episodes when Laura was out, I asked if they would like me to just take over editing those. Might as well, since I was hired to be on the clock regardless of the work. Once that happened, I began editing all of those, including the spin-off Doctors and eventually the Boston's Favorite Son. The podcast had a reputation for them constantly interrupting each other, mostly due to the lag, which immediately stopped when I began editing, as I was spending long hours moving audio to make it sound as legible and natural as possible. After some time, I asked if they also wanted me to edit the gameplay video, Jimpressions, and soon the Jimquisition. Within 2 years, I was editing almost everything in addition to whatever else they asked me to help with. Many of those things did not involve work at all. After their separation from their ex, I was frequently their go-to driver.
Oh yes, everyone's favorite kind of editing work, taxi driving.
I drove them all around the state and other states for wrestling shows, many of which I would also film or record for them. I would drive them to the doctor's appointments, getting their citizenship completed, and more. I was getting paid for full-time hours, so why not? That full-time job began being described less as a full-time by them.
We're only just beginning, and this is sounding less and less like a part-time job.
The more things were added to my workload, namely when the time would come around to discuss my expected raise. The first year was straightforward, with a $100 bump to $1,600 a month. It's not a ton of money, but it was more than what I had been making, and at the time I was splitting finances with my then wife. The next year, however, started a new trend of there always being a reason. There was always a reason for why I couldn't get an increase in pay. Finances with their ex from the split were messy, surprises with taxes being dropped on them, and of course, moving across the country.
Sterling's divorce from their wife was a thing that happened which could legitimately fuck over one's finances. Not delivering on pay raises that are previously agreed upon is very shitty though. And also blaming taxes as well. Yeah, that's not a good fucking reason. If you got your taxes all fucked up and you can't pay your employees, that's not your employee's fault. Keep in mind though that there is no proof for the editor's side, just like there's no proof for Jim's side of the story.
I did not complain at first. I understood the reasons. I knew they were dealing with stuff. Sure, it didn't stop them from making extravagant purchases for themselves, but I tried to look past that. They were my friend, so of course they were gonna look out for me. This is James Stephanie Sterling, champion of the people. They wouldn't intentionally exploit me, so I waited another year for a discussion of a raise, but by this point my own life had taken a turn, and I was going through my own expensive divorce full of fun financial surprises.
A lot of divorce going on around here in the Jimquisition universe, goddamn.
At the end of 2019, they told me that they were leaving Mississippi for Philadelphia, PA. In February 2020, they asked if I would like to come along, stay in their place for a while as I got set up in my own place.
The prospect of moving just to stay with James Stephanie Sterling is, well, we sometimes make poor decisions for jobs, and that certainly was one. Holy shit.
The plans were not to stay together for long, but who could have expected a global pandemic to start right as you move across the country? It was a scary prospect for me as someone who had lived in Mississippi their whole life, but they gave me some reassurances. They could stay with me for free, and once we get set up, they would catch up on my raises, as well as adjust my income for the increased cost of living. Philadelphia is noticeably pricier to live in than the majority of Mississippi. So I packed my bags and got ready to move. I kept finding ways to help out. I looked up moving companies for them, all of which cost thousands of dollars. The cheapest one I found at the time being $1,500 and would take over a month to bring the stuff from Mississippi to Philly. I told them they could save money and we could rent a U-Haul and drive it up ourselves, which is sort of what happened. We rented the U-Haul, but then they flew up early to appear at a wrestling show. So I unloaded all my stuff and everything they owned into the U-Haul myself and drove it across the country. I felt like saving them possibly thousands of dollars should help balance out the non-cost of me staying in their place for a few months.
Another red flag on top of the pile, having to pack up all of Sterling's belongings for them along with their own and driving all the way up to their new residence. Since he's living with them for free as an employee, the editor feels it works out and it's fair for now. Until the laborer from his indentured servitude starts getting out of hand.
It wasn't until August of 2020 that I was finally able to move out.
From February to August, he'd be staying there about 6 months, just like Jim said. A decent amount of time considering he's only making about $1,800 to $1,900 a year. More excuses start about not receiving those raises agreed upon as well.
During which we switched to a new apartment building since they had gotten an apartment without actually having checked it out and had many issues, which meant breaking the lease to move into a more expensive place. I managed to find a place that was not great, but it was cheap and I could afford it. Besides, they were going to increase my pay after all. Once I moved out, the reasons began again. They just couldn't afford it after all. I had just moved into a cheap apartment that was still over half of my income, grocery bills, and utility bills on the rise, but they had financial issues. I was stressed out. I just signed a lease for a new place and becoming increasingly low on money fast. My ex-wife was making sure that every financial burden we had together went onto my shoulders if I wanted a simple divorce, and I became stressed out fast. I vented to a then mutual friend.
Now we get to where Sterling says the editor talked incredibly hurtfully behind their back by confiding in a friend that in simplest terms, they were broke as fuck.
I was broke as fuck.
Someone I was told I could trust repeatedly. I was freaking out about how can I afford to do this if I had made a mistake and was just being angry in general. They proceeded to tell my boss everything I had told them. I was asked to come over to talk where I was scolded for discussing this stuff behind their back. How dare an employee talk about their work life and pay, am I right? They told me that they would catch up on my yearly raises and that'd be the end of the conversation. That'd be also the last raise I ever got. No more yearly raises, no cost of living increase. I got $200 more and I should be grateful. After all, I only worked 2 days a week. That last thing came out of nowhere. See, apparently they decided some time ago that the only work I did was ed the Jimquisition and Podquisition, and therefore I was paid more than enough. I was not a full-time employee suddenly, but a part-time worker. An ungrateful one at that. And I want to break down that logic for a moment since that's what they highlighted in their own statement. $1,800 a month for 2 days of work. Let's say on average there are 4 weeks in a month. So 8 work days in a month. That's $225 a day or $28.13 rounding up to an hour. The assumption is for an 8-hour work day, though it was rarely only 8 hours of work. But let's leave it at that. $28.13 an hour is decent pay. The starting rate for a video producer on average is $25 to $35. So sure, not the 30 to 40 they claim, and that doesn't include that as an independent contractor that I had to pay my own taxes from that, but it still sounds good. If I was only working 2 days a week, if I was only getting paid for editing those 2 things in those 2 days, that means literally everything else I did for them was unpaid. None of the other podcasts, none of the gameplay videos, and certainly none of the trips taking them everywhere in the past. Those were all freebies suddenly.
Jim Sterling out here offering unpaid internships to be a chauffeur. Also with with a little bit of, video editing on the side.
Because that's the thing James Stephanie Sterling didn't think about. I was either 1, an unpaid full-time worker, $11.25 an hour, $1,800 for 4 weeks, 40 hours a week, or a decently paid 2-day worker who wasn't paid for a lot of their work. That hurt. I was already hurt by the betrayal of trust from a supposed friend, and even more from someone I wasn't sure that I could depend on when making the biggest change of my life. I was pushed on. Even as my new life in Philly was getting complicated with new additions that added an ass load of stress and brand new financial burdens, I didn't complain to my boss. They were struggling too, after all. It became harder to swallow when I go back to their apartment to help them with work, apparently unpaid if it wasn't a Sunday or a Wednesday, and there to be some brand new expensive purchase in their place, some new giant statue, expensive furniture that I assembled for them, etc. So yeah, I was upset. I was freaking out about how I was going to keep affording groceries each month, keep paying the bills, and dealing with other financial surprises that kept popping up. Every now and then I would mention some new stress to my boss and they'd say, "I'll send you a little cash to help you out." I gladly took it because I had no choice, but I would have preferred to be paid what I was promised. The message they got recently was from 2 friends. I won't go into details on them because they deserve their own respect of privacy. But yes, I complained to them about my job too. I complained about my work. I complained about my pay. I complained about Steph. I was tired, stressed out, and I once again trusted people who said they could be trusted. I learned after a while that they weren't the people that I thought they were. And apparently a year after us all blocking each other, they decided to start sending messages to people I know complaining about me, and namely telling my boss everything I said about them. Well, since James Stephanie Sterling has decided that me talking about this to a handful of people in private deserves a public response mirroring my name, let me tell you who they are. James Stephanie Sterling is a hypocrite. They have likened themselves as someone who fights for the defenseless and batters capitalism on a daily basis, but this does not include their own employee. They're a champion of free speech who has multiple times made me delete tweets because they were worried and make them look bad. The Jimquisition has proudly stated that people deserve to be treated with respect and properly credited, even as their work was I and my work became we. As episode 300 and 400 of Podquisition passed and everyone got called out for their help, except for the person spending his night untangling their nonsense. And for someone who was deeply offended at the idea that I was bad-mouthing them behind their back, they seem to have no issue doing the same to others, whether getting angry at Laura and Conrad for talking over them constantly on the podcast, or the way that they talked about Phoenix's kids, which deeply made me uncomfortable, but I tried going along. Apparently it's fine to complain to me, but how dare I have my own frustrations? How dare I have my own issues and stress? Yes, the money they make from Patreon isn't as much when it finally gets to them. Taxes and fees cut that down, as well as people paying for their help. It's still more than what I was making. At no point was James Stephanie Sterling worried about how they were going to afford to eat, how they were going to be able to pay for rent. No, they didn't have to worry about that. Just their employee.
So now we got a he said, they said situation between the two of them. Again, we don't have evidence for either side. The main issue with this whole situation is it never needed to become public, but Jim Sterling decided to make it so.
Last Monday, I typed a letter explaining to them I was quitting. I was tired of the way I was treating. I was tired of being left on red and frequently ignored, whether it was about work or just trying to have a conversation and stay friends with them. A friend of mine called me down and say I should take a moment to breathe and wait to talk to him later. The next day, James Stephanie Sterling called to fire me. I've never slept better than I have since that phone call. For the first time in years, my stress has plummeted and I am free. I've been staying with my family recently after moving out of Philly due to rising costs and have been putting back a majority of my paychecks in anticipation of this day. I no longer have to deal with their anger management on set, pouting, throwing things around if something broke the flow of filming, etc. No more hearing them complain about how hard life is for them while they fill their houses with toys and move countries just to date people. And maybe even best of all, I never have to type the name Bobby Kotick into Google image search again.
So it's the editor's word versus Sterling's word on this situation, since Sterling hasn't really said what the editor did to those other people that he allegedly committed the same acts against, and won't name them either. They basically don't exist for this whole situation. At the end of the day, Sterling took time to shut on a former employee, make accusations with no proof, and essentially say that that editor is a repeat abuser to them and others around them. It's clear that in the beginning they were friends to some degree, and that friendship may have fallen through, but that doesn't mean you gotta nuke their reputation to the point of finding new work as an editor is completely crippled. Sterling must have dropped that Patreon post to ensure this dude is pushing shopping carts for the rest of his life, because without digging around for just inside of the story, who's gonna hire this guy?